Hashtag the houses that shaped a king. Inside Michael Jackson's search for home, every legend needs a place to begin. For Michael Jackson, that place was a two-bedroom house barely larger than most people's living rooms. By the time his story ended, he had lived behind the gates of a private amusement park, inside a French chateau, and within a fortress in the Nevada desert. But here's a question worth sitting with before we go any further. Can a man who owned dozens of properties across 3 decades ever truly find a place that felt like home? Stay with this one because the answer might surprise you. Hashtag a two-bedroom beginning. Let's start where it all started. Gary, Indiana, 1958. The address was 2300 Jackson Street, a modest wood-frame bungalow of roughly 672 square feet. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 11 people. Think about that number for a second. 11 family members under one small roof, Joe and Catherine Jackson, and 9 children, all sharing space that many modern apartments would dwarf. There was no room for privacy, no room for silence, and, as it turned out, no room for anything except talent to grow in the cracks. The living room doubled as a rehearsal hall. The Jackson brothers learned to harmonize while practically standing on top of each other. Turning a lack of space into a strange kind of advantage, you learn to move in sync with someone when you have nowhere else to move. Catherine's cooking filled the kitchen. Joe's discipline filled everything else. Michael lived in this house until he was 11 years old. 11 years inside 672 square feet. And yet somehow those cramped walls held the first sparks of a career that would eventually fill stadiums on every continent. The city of Gary has since preserved the home as a historic site, and fans still make pilgrimages there today. It raises an interesting thought. How many of the world's biggest icons started out in rooms smaller than the one you're sitting in right now? Hashtag leaving the Midwest behind. In 1969, the Jackson 5 signed with Motown, and within what felt like moments, the family was uprooted from Indiana's gray skies and dropped into the sunshine of Los Angeles. After a stretch of hotel living, during which young Michael spent considerable time as a guest of Diana Ross, the family settled into a rented, Mediterranean-style property on Queens Road in West Hollywood. This wasn't a forever home. It was a decompression chamber, a space where a family that had spent years crammed into a bungalow could finally exhale. Wide streets, warm air, the unmistakable hum of an industry that was about to make them famous. Michael was still a child navigating an adult world at breakneck speed, rehearsing choreography one week while the family searched for something more permanent the next. But everyone involved understood this rental was temporary, a stepping stone between who they had been and who they were about to become, a place to catch their breath before the real climb started. It's worth pausing on just how fast this transition happened. One year, the family was navigating a working-class neighborhood in the industrial Midwest. The next, they were rehearsing under the California sun with one of the biggest labels in music behind them. Have you ever gone through a change that fast in your own life? It's hard to imagine what that kind of whiplash does to a child barely old enough to understand what fame even meant. Hashtag Havenhurst, the real family home. If any property deserves to be called the true Jackson family estate, it's Havenhurst, purchased in Encino in 1971. 2 acres of land might not sound extravagant by celebrity standards today, but for a family that had spent over a decade sharing bedrooms, it was an entirely different world. This is where Michael grew up in the fullest sense. Not just physically, but artistically. The off-the-wall era took shape here. So did the earliest sparks of Thriller. Producers, choreographers, and musicians cycled through constantly, turning the estate into something closer to a creative headquarters than a quiet suburban home. By the early 1980s, Michael had bought the property outright from his father, a small but meaningful act of independence. Soon after, he undertook a massive renovation, effectively rebuilding the house from the ground up. A second story went up to house private bedrooms. A 32-seat home theater appeared, because apparently a regular television just wasn't going to cut it. A trophy room was built to hold a growing mountain of awards, and, perhaps most tellingly, a private recording studio was installed right on the grounds. It was inside that studio that early demos for Thriller first took shape, years before the album would go on to become the best-selling record in history. The renovation borrowed heavily from English Tudor architecture. Stately gables, dark timber accents, a sense of permanence that stood in sharp contrast to the modest bungalow he'd grown up in. Havenhurst stopped being just a place the family lived and became something closer to a working studio, a rehearsal space, and a creative laboratory all rolled into one property. Choreographers dropped by unannounced. Songs got written at odd hours. The estate rarely slept. Here's something worth asking yourself. When you finally have the means to build exactly the life you imagined as a kid, what's the first room you'd build? ## Neverland. A kingdom built from loneliness. March 1988 changed everything. Michael purchased more than 700 acres of rolling ranchland in Santa Barbara County for a price somewhere between $17 and $30 million, and renamed it Neverland Valley Ranch, a name borrowed directly from the boy who refused to grow up. He had first walked this land while visiting Paul McCartney, and something about the oak trees and open hills spoke to him immediately. But the deeper motivation ran further than scenery. Michael was 30 years old and, for the first time in his life, moving out entirely on his own terms. No father managing the gate, no family calendar dictating his days. After a lifetime spent performing for other people, Neverland was his declaration that something, finally, would belong only to him. And what he built there had never existed on private land before. A full amusement park rose out of the California hillside. A Ferris wheel, a carousel, bumper cars, roller coasters, their tracks winding through hills that had once held nothing but oak trees and open grass. A private zoo housed elephants, giraffes, and exotic birds. A menagerie that rivaled facilities open to the public. A steam train named Catherine, after his mother, wound along dedicated tracks that circled the entire property, its whistle audible from nearly every corner of the ranch. Then he opened the gates to thousands of children from hospitals and underprivileged communities, giving them a day most had never imagined possible. In many ways, Neverland wasn't built for adults at all. It was Michael attempting to hand back a childhood he felt he'd never fully had, having been performing professionally since the age of 5. Maintaining all of it cost close to $10 million a year, and by every account he never once hesitated to spend it. At the center of the spectacle sat something surprisingly restrained. A 13,000 square foot French Normandy-style residence, with dark wood paneling, antique European flooring, and a hidden room concealed behind a library shelf. A retreat within a retreat, tucked inside a home that was already a sanctuary from the world. Would you have guessed that behind all the roller coasters and elephants, the actual house Michael lived in was this understated? It's a detail that rarely makes the headlines. ## when the sanctuary was broken. Michael lived at Neverland for more than 15 years, until 2005 changed the story permanently. Following a trial that captured global attention, he was acquitted on every count that June. But acquittal didn't undo what had already happened. During the investigation, law enforcement had searched the property room by room, corridor by corridor. Something about the place never recovered. Michael announced, quietly but with total finality, that he would never live at Neverland again. The rides went still. The trains stopped running. A home built to hold on to childhood had, in his eyes, become something closer to a crime scene. He began moving instead, searching, unsettled, carrying his children from one temporary refuge to the next. ## finding air in Bahrain. Late 2005 found Michael on the island of Bahrain, a guest of the royal family, who offered him private villas and something he hadn't experienced in years. Distance from American media. No cameras waiting outside the gate. No headlines waiting to be written. He spent his days writing music and simply being present with his children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket. For a man who had been performing since childhood, doing essentially nothing, resting, existing without an audience, was almost a radical act. There were no scheduled appearances, no choreography to rehearse, no cameras waiting at the end of the driveway. Couldn't last forever, and he knew it. Eventually, the pull of his career, his culture, and his creative obligations would draw him back toward the West. But for a while, Bahrain gave him room to breathe in a way almost nowhere else had in years. ## quiet fields in Ireland. By 2006, Michael had relocated his family to County Westmeath, Ireland, first renting Castletown House before settling closer to the Grouse Lodge recording studios. The Irish countryside offered something almost nobody else had given him in years: anonymity. He walked outdoors without 100 lenses tracking his every step. He recorded new material. His children played outside without the weight of constant public attention. Ask yourself this: after a lifetime under the brightest lights imaginable, what would it take for gray skies and quiet rain to start feeling like relief instead of gloom? ## Las Vegas. Two different fortresses. Late 2006 brought Michael back to American soil, this time to Las Vegas, where he rented a 17,000 square foot Mediterranean estate on Monte Cristo Way for $50,000 a month. High walls, tight security, and total privacy made it less a home than a fortress, one built partly around the idea of a potential Las Vegas concert residency. In 2007, he moved again, this time to a 1.7-acre compound on Palomino Lane that would later become known among fans as the Thriller Villa, named by the property owner after his passing. Spanning more than 24,000 square feet, it included a private chapel, a home theater, and a hidden basement gallery built to display his art collection. Gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and deep red velvet gave the interior the feel of a palace dropped into the middle of the desert. He lived here for nearly 2 years with his children, largely shielded from public view, able to walk the grounds without a single lens tracking him. It remains, to this day, one of the most sought-after locations for fans hoping to retrace his final years in America. ## The final address. In December 2008, Michael signed a lease on 100 North Carrollwood Drive in Holmby Hills, a French-style chateau designed by architect Richard Landry, rented for $100,000 a month. This wasn't chosen for comfort. It was chosen for proximity. With the This Is It concert series looming, 50 shows scheduled at London's O2 Arena, Michael needed to be close to rehearsal spaces, and he needed to be sharp. Mirrors lined several rooms for dance rehearsal. The house, formal and almost hotel-like with 3 floors, 13 bathrooms, and 12 fireplaces, was never really meant to feel like home, and by most accounts it never quite did. A guest house sat beside a large swimming pool, and Michael's 3 children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, had their own wing where they could study and play away from the pressure that filled the rest of the house. No matter how demanding rehearsals became, he made sure that pocket of calm stayed protected. Michael tried to soften the formality wherever he could. He filled the shelves with his own books and films. He brought in his children's artwork and hung it in rooms that had clearly been designed by someone who had never met the family living inside them. It was a workspace dressed up as a home, a temporary backdrop for what would become one of the most talked-about final chapters in modern entertainment history. And yet, in the middle of all that formality, something small and human survived. In the kitchen, a chalkboard carried 4 words written in a child's handwriting: "I love Daddy." Michael never erased it. Every morning, Prince, Paris, and Blanket climbed onto bar stools at the counter for breakfast, and Michael sat with them, not as an icon, just as their father. Shelves nearby held children's books and classic films they watched together in the evenings. It's easy to picture Michael Jackson only through stadium lights and record sales. But maybe the truest image of him is something far smaller. A father at a kitchen counter, refusing to erase 4 words written in chalk. ## What the Houses Leave Behind. From a 672 square foot bungalow in Gary to a 2,700-acre ranch built like a fantasy kingdom, Michael Jackson's homes trace the entire arc of an extraordinary and complicated life. Some he owned, some he rented and simply tried to make feel like his own. Almost none of them ever managed to stay peaceful for long. So here's a final question worth leaving you with. After all the mansions, all the acreage, all the private zoos and hidden rooms, Do you think Michael Jackson ever actually found the one thing all that space was supposed to give him? Drop your thoughts below, and if a particular house on this list surprised you, let us know which one it was.